Imagine a future thousands of years from now in which our cities have collapsed, our languages have become unreadable, and the systems that quietly governed everyday life have left behind only partial traces. Future scholars attempt to reconstruct who we were from fragments of infrastructure, damaged records, and references stripped of context. They encounter mentions of invisible forces that once shaped behavior and decision-making, abstract mechanisms that structured society but were never designed to explain themselves. From these remains, they try to infer our beliefs, our hierarchies, and our understanding of reality. And despite their best efforts, they would almost certainly misunderstand us, not because they lacked intelligence or evidence, but because the most important structures of our world were never intended to survive as explanations for the future. This is precisely the position we occupy when we attempt to understand the Anunnaki. Before we go any deeper, feel free to let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy reading those messages, and it never stops being fascinating to see how these questions and these silences are being explored by people all over the world, often at very different moments of the day and night. And as always, the images you see here are simply meant to provide atmosphere and context. Thank you, as ever, for being here and for continuing to explore these forgotten questions with us. The Anunnaki appear throughout the earliest written records of Mesopotamia, embedded deeply within the cultural and religious framework of the civilizations that produced the first known writing systems. Their name recurs across administrative texts, ritual instructions, mythological narratives, and cosmological references, always treated as something already known, already established, already understood. They are commonly translated as gods, sometimes described as judges or authorities who decree fate, sometimes associated with cosmic order and the structure of the universe itself, and yet for all their apparent importance, they remain fundamentally undefined. There is no clear origin story that introduces them, no unified genealogy that explains their relationships, no definitive list that settles who belongs among them and who does not, and no narrative that describes how they came into being or what ultimately became of them. They enter the historical record without preface and without explanation, already occupying positions of authority, and then over time they recede into the background, leaving behind references without resolution. This absence is not the result of a single missing tablet or an unfortunate gap in excavation. It is consistent, widespread, and deeply embedded in the structure of the surviving material. The silence surrounding the Anunnaki is not accidental. It is systematic. Modern audiences often approach ancient history with assumptions shaped by contemporary storytelling. We expect clear beginnings, coherent developments, and meaningful conclusions. We assume that figures of importance will be introduced, defined, and contextualized, and that their roles will be clarified in ways that make sense to later readers. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do not conform to these expectations. They do not explain their gods to outsiders. They do not introduce their cosmology as if it were unfamiliar. They do not pause to define what their audience was already assumed to know. Instead, these texts speak inwardly, addressing readers who were already embedded within the same cultural system, who shared the same assumptions, and who did not require foundational explanations. Writing in this context was not an act of teaching future generations, but a tool for administration, ritual continuity, and social order. It recorded what needed to be recorded, not what needed to be explained. This creates a fundamental problem for modern interpretation. When we ask who the Anunnaki were, we are asking a question that the surviving texts were never designed to answer. We are listening in on a conversation that was not meant for us, attempting to reconstruct meaning from references that once relied on shared understanding that no longer exists. What makes this silence especially unsettling is that the Anunnaki are not marginal or obscure. They are not minor spirits mentioned once and forgotten. They appear repeatedly and persistently across different categories of text, suggesting that they occupied a central position within the Mesopotamian worldview. And yet, despite this prominence, they are never explained. Their authority is assumed, their presence taken for granted, their role invoked but not defined. This contradiction lies at the heart of what can be called the lost epoch. The lost epoch is not a missing civilization in the conventional sense. It is not a buried city waiting to be excavated or a forgotten empire waiting to be rediscovered. It is a missing layer of context, a foundational framework of understanding that once made these texts coherent to their original audience, but is now inaccessible to us. It represents not a gap in evidence alone, but a gap in comprehension. We often think of history as something that accumulates, believing that as time passes, knowledge expands, records multiply, and understanding improves. Ancient history frequently moves in the opposite direction. The further back we look, the more fragmented the record becomes, not merely incomplete, but structurally incomplete. The earliest written texts do not represent the beginning of human thought or belief. They represent the moment when thought began to be selectively written down. Writing did not capture everything. It captured what was necessary, what was functional, and what served systems of administration, ritual practice, and authority. It did not capture shared assumptions, foundational explanations, or ideas that were considered too obvious to record. The Anunnaki belong to this missing category. They appear not as subjects in need of definition, but as part of the background architecture of reality, invoked without explanation in the same way modern scientific texts invoke gravity without pausing to justify its existence. This silence creates a powerful temptation for modern readers. Faced with ambiguity, we rush to fill it. We invent narratives, impose structures, and project modern categories onto ancient concepts. We seek origins, motives, and conclusions where none were ever recorded. In doing so, we risk mistaking the absence of explanation for the absence of understanding. Silence is not always a void. Sometimes it is a boundary. The absence of explanation does not mean the Anunnaki were poorly understood by the people who wrote about them. It may indicate the opposite, that their role was so deeply embedded in the worldview of the time that writing it down would have been redundant or even inappropriate. In many ancient societies, the most important knowledge was not written at all. It was transmitted orally, guarded within specific social roles, and contextualized through practice rather than text. Writing was a tool for maintaining order, not for preserving revelation. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Anunnaki were never meant to be understood by later generations? What if their silence is not a failure of preservation, but a feature of the system itself? If that is the case, then the problem is not that the story was lost. The problem is that we are searching for a story that was never written. The lost epoch begins here, not with a catastrophe or a disappearance, but with a refusal of the past to fully explain itself to the future. The Anunnaki stand at the center of this refusal, present everywhere yet defined nowhere, powerful yet impersonal, central yet silent. Before we can ask what they were, we must confront a more difficult question: why history at its deepest level sometimes chooses not to speak, and what that silence reveals about how ancient civilizations understood knowledge, power, and memory itself. To understand why the Anunnaki appear without explanation, it is necessary to step away from the question of who they were and instead examine how the civilization that wrote about them understood writing itself. Mesopotamian society did not treat written language as a tool for preserving complete knowledge for future generations. Writing emerged there for specific, practical purposes, and those purposes shaped not only what was recorded, but also what was deliberately left unwritten. The earliest writing systems developed in Mesopotamia were administrative before they were narrative. They tracked goods, labor, land, and obligations. They recorded offerings to temples, distributions of grain, lists of workers, and inventories of resources. Writing was a technology of management, not a medium for explanation. It served institutions, not curiosity, and it assumed a shared cultural framework that did not need to be spelled out. When mythological and cosmological texts later began to appear, they inherited this same assumption. They were not composed as instructional manuals for outsiders or as comprehensive accounts of belief. They were created within a closed cultural system for audiences who already understood the underlying structures of their world. The texts do not introduce their gods because the gods did not need introduction. They do not explain their cosmology because the cosmology was already lived, enacted, and reinforced through ritual, architecture, and social order. This inward-facing nature of Mesopotamian writing creates a profound distortion when viewed from a modern perspective. We approach these texts as if they were meant to teach us something, as if they were attempts to preserve meaning across time. In reality, they were attempts to stabilize meaning within the present. They were written to maintain continuity, authority, and order in a world where those things were fragile and constantly renegotiated. The Anunnaki are embedded within this system as assumed knowledge. Their name appears without clarification because clarification was unnecessary for the intended reader. To someone living within Mesopotamian society, the Anunnaki were not mysterious entities requiring definition. They were part of the conceptual environment, as familiar and unquestioned as the land, the sky, or the hierarchy of the city itself. This explains a pattern that recurs across the surviving texts. Whenever the Anunnaki are mentioned, they are invoked in passing as part of a larger structure that does not pause to examine itself. They function as a reference point, not as a subject of inquiry. Their authority is cited, their presence acknowledged, but their nature is never unpacked. The texts move on, assuming comprehension. This assumption becomes especially visible when contrasted with how Mesopotamian writers treated unfamiliar concepts. When a new ritual practice was introduced, it was described in detail. When a legal reform was enacted, it was recorded carefully. When a city was founded or destroyed, its significance was elaborated. But when the Anunnaki are mentioned, there is no elaboration at all. Their role is treated as self-evident. From a modern standpoint, this is deeply unsettling. We are conditioned to believe that what is most important will be most clearly explained. In Mesopotamian writing, the opposite is often true. What was most foundational was often left implicit precisely because it was foundational. It formed the background against which all other actions made sense, and backgrounds are rarely described by those who live within them. This creates what can be called an asymmetry of understanding. The original audience possessed a vast amount of contextual knowledge that never entered the written record. We, by contrast, possess the written record but lack the context. As a result, we are left with texts that feel incomplete, not because they are fragmentary, but because they were never meant to stand alone. The Anunnaki exemplify this problem more clearly than almost any other element of Mesopotamian belief. Their silence is not the silence of erasure, but the silence of assumed familiarity. They are not absent from the record. They are embedded too deeply within it to be singled out. This inward orientation of writing also reflects broader attitudes toward knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia. Knowledge was not considered something to be universally accessible. It was hierarchical, contextual, and often restricted. Certain forms of understanding were reserved for priests, scribes, and elites who had undergone specific training. Writing was one tool among many in this system, and not necessarily the most important one. Much of what mattered most was transmitted through practice rather than text. Rituals were performed, not explained. Authority was enacted, not justified. Cosmology was lived, not diagrammed. The written word functioned as reinforcement, not revelation. Seen in this light, the absence of explanation surrounding the Anunnaki begins to look less like a failure and more like a clue. It suggests that their meaning was not contained in stories alone, but distributed across social structures, religious practices, and institutional roles that no longer exist. The written texts are only the visible surface of a much larger system that has largely disappeared. This also helps explain why later civilizations struggled to interpret Mesopotamian beliefs, even when the texts were still readable. As political systems changed and cultural continuity fractured, the assumptions that once made the texts intelligible began to erode. What had once been obvious became opaque, and what had once been implicit became unknowable. By the time modern scholars began translating cuneiform tablets, the gap had become unbridgeable. We inherited the words, but not the world that gave those words meaning. We can analyze grammar, reconstruct vocabulary, and compare texts, but we cannot recover the lived context that made the Anunnaki intelligible without explanation. This realization forces a shift in how the question should be framed. Instead of asking why the texts fail to explain the Anunnaki, we must ask why we expect them to. The silence we encounter is not an oversight. It is a product of a civilization that wrote for itself, not for us, and that assumed its most important structures did not need to be preserved in writing. The Anunnaki stand as a reminder that writing is not synonymous with knowledge, and that what survives in the historical record is often what was considered least in need of explanation at the time. Their silence marks the boundary between what could be written and what was simply known. Before we can move closer to understanding who or what the Anunnaki were, we must first accept this uncomfortable truth. We are not missing the explanation because it was lost. We are missing it because it was never meant to exist in written form at all. At the center of the silence surrounding the Anunnaki lies a problem that appears deceptively simple but becomes more complex the closer it is examined. The name itself is well known, frequently cited, and often treated as if it refers to a clearly defined group. Yet when the texts are examined carefully, it becomes apparent that the Anunnaki are not introduced as characters in a story, nor as a lineage with a beginning, nor even as a stable category with fixed boundaries. They are named, invoked, and assumed, but never narrated. In this sense, the Anunnaki represents something rare in ancient literature, a central concept without a story of its own. The term Anunnaki is commonly translated as the offspring of An, the sky god, but this translation, while linguistically defensible, explains very little. It does not tell us how many Anunnaki there were, whether the group was fixed or fluid, whether membership could change, or what criteria defined inclusion. In different texts, the Anunnaki appear to function in different ways. Sometimes they are described as a collective body that participates in decisions affecting the cosmos. In other cases, they appear as judges associated with the underworld. Elsewhere, they seem to function as a broader category of high-ranking divine authorities. These roles overlap, but they do not resolve into a single, coherent portrait. What is striking is that none of these texts pause to explain the transition between these roles. There is no narrative that tells us how the Anunnaki came to occupy different domains, or why their functions appear to shift depending on context. The texts do not frame these differences as contradictions, nor do they attempt to reconcile them. They simply assume that the reader understands how the term operates within each situation. This is not how ancient texts typically handle important figures. Individual gods such as Enlil, Enki, Inanna, or Utu possess rich narrative traditions. They have myths that explain their origins, their conflicts, their transformations, and their relationships. Their personalities are developed through story, and their domains are reinforced through repeated narrative patterns. The Anunnaki, by contrast, do not receive this treatment. They are not individualized. They do not act as protagonists. They do not undergo change or development. They exist as a category, not as characters. This absence is revealing. It suggests that the Anunnaki were not conceived as mythological figures in the same way other gods were. They function more like an institutional concept than a narrative one. Rather than being defined by story, they are defined by position. Their authority does not emerge from mythic struggle or heroic action, but from their assumed place within the structure of reality. In modern terms, the Anunnaki resemble a governing body more than a pantheon of personalities. They are invoked collectively, their decisions referenced without explanation, their authority accepted without justification. When they appear, it is not to entertain or instruct, but to establish legitimacy. Fate is decreed because the Anunnaki have decreed it. Order exists because they have sanctioned it. The texts do not ask why this is so, because for their original audience, the answer was already known or did not require articulation. This raises an important distinction between naming and explaining. To name something is not necessarily to describe it. In Mesopotamian texts, naming often functions as an act of recognition rather than definition. By invoking the Anunnaki, a text situates itself within a recognized framework of authority. It signals alignment with a cosmological order that does not need to be restated. The absence of a story, therefore, does not imply that the Anunnaki lacked meaning. It implies that their meaning was located elsewhere. It may have resided in ritual practice, in legal tradition, in temple hierarchy, or in oral instruction passed down through generations of priests and scribes. The written texts preserve the name, but not the explanatory system that gave that name substance. This helps explain why later readers, both ancient and modern, struggled to interpret the Anunnaki consistently. Without access to the original framework, the name becomes unstable. It absorbs new interpretations. It is recontextualized, simplified, or exaggerated. Over time, the Anunnaki begin to look less like a precise concept and more like a mystery, not because they were mysterious to those who first invoked them, but because the scaffolding that once supported their meaning has collapsed. There is also a deeper implication here. The lack of a story suggests that the Anunnaki were not meant to be contemplated in isolation. They were not objects of belief in the modern sense, where belief involves conscious assent to defined propositions. Instead, they were part of a lived system, a background structure that shaped how the world was understood and navigated. Asking who the Anunnaki were, in this context, is like asking who the law is, or who gravity is. The question itself misunderstands the nature of the concept. This is why attempts to reconstruct a single, unified description of the Anunnaki inevitably fail. The texts do not support such a reconstruction because they were never organized around that goal. The Anunnaki were not a story to be told. They were a framework within which stories made sense. Once this is recognized, the silence surrounding them takes on a different character. It is no longer an absence to be corrected, but a signpost indicating the limits of what writing was used to preserve. The Anunnaki mark the boundary between narrative and structure, between what could be told and what was simply assumed. Understanding this does not solve the mystery of the Anunnaki, but it reframes it. The question shifts from who they were to what kind of concept they represented within Mesopotamian thought. It suggests that the lost epoch is not only a loss of information, but a loss of an entire mode of understanding in which certain things did not require stories to exist. Before moving further, one question remains unresolved, and it will shape everything that follows. If the Anunnaki were not defined by story, but by function and authority, how did they operate within the myths that do survive, and why do they appear everywhere yet never take center stage? When the surviving mythological texts of Mesopotamia are examined as a whole, a consistent and unsettling pattern emerges. The Anunnaki are present across the literary landscape, appearing in stories that describe the creation of the world, the ordering of the cosmos, the regulation of divine authority, and the fate of humanity itself. Yet despite this widespread presence, they almost never act as the central figures of these narratives. They are invoked, consulted, or referenced, but rarely dramatized. They stand behind events rather than within them, shaping outcomes without becoming the focus of the story. In epics, hymns, and ritual texts alike, the Anunnaki occupy a peculiar position. They are described as those who decree fate, those who authorize decisions, those whose collective will carries cosmic weight. But when decisive moments occur, it is usually other gods who speak, argue, act, or suffer consequences. The Anunnaki remain in the background, their authority implicit rather than demonstrated. Their presence is felt rather than seen. This narrative distance is significant. Ancient mythologies typically personify power through action. Gods struggle, compete, deceive, and transform. Their stories explain why the world is the way it is. In Mesopotamian literature, many deities follow this pattern. Enlil commands storms and enforces order. Enki manipulates knowledge and intervenes through cunning. Inanna embodies ambition, desire, and transformation. Each of these figures is given a narrative identity that makes their domain intelligible through story. The Anunnaki do not follow this pattern. They do not have adventures. They do not pursue personal goals. They do not change. Instead, they function as a collective presence whose authority is assumed and rarely questioned. When they appear, it is often in scenes where decisions are formalized rather than debated, where outcomes are ratified rather than contested. They resemble an institutional body more than a cast of characters. This becomes especially clear in texts where the Anunnaki are associated with judgment. In some contexts, they appear as judges of the underworld, presiding over matters of fate and consequence. Yet even here, the texts do not describe deliberation or process. The judgment is already decided by the time it is mentioned. The Anunnaki do not argue their case. They simply represent the finality of the decision. Such portrayals suggest that the Anunnaki were not imagined as personalities with individual wills, but as embodiments of order itself. They represent the stabilizing framework within which other divine actions occur. While other gods may disrupt, innovate, or rebel, the Anunnaki remain constant, anchoring the system against collapse. Their silence within the narrative mirrors their function. They do not need to speak because their authority does not depend on persuasion. This helps explain why they appear across so many different types of texts without ever being explained. Their role transcended genre. Whether the text was mythological, ritual, or administrative, the Anunnaki served as a reference point for legitimacy. Invoking them signaled that an action, decision, or outcome aligned with the deepest structures of cosmic order. From a modern perspective, this is deeply counterintuitive. We tend to associate importance with visibility and explanation. We expect the most powerful figures to occupy the center of the story. In Mesopotamian thought, the opposite appears to be true. The most fundamental authorities operate invisibly, shaping reality without drawing attention to themselves. This inversion becomes clearer when we consider how these texts would have been experienced by their original audience. The Anunnaki did not need to be dramatized because their role was not something to be imagined. It was something to be accepted. Their authority was not contested in story because it was not contested in life. It was woven into legal systems, temple hierarchies, and social order. To question it would have been to question the structure of the world itself. As a result, the Anunnaki function more like a constitutional framework than a group of mythological characters. They define the limits within which action is possible. They authorize outcomes without participating in the drama that leads to them. Their presence signals closure rather than conflict. This also explains why the Anunnaki rarely appear as objects of devotion in the way other gods do. There are temples dedicated to individual deities, hymns praising their attributes, prayers appealing to their favor. There is no comparable body of material focused on worship of the Anunnaki as a collective. They are not approached as beings to be persuaded or appeased. They are acknowledged as forces that already stand beyond negotiation. The absence of narrative focus, therefore, does not diminish their importance. It elevates it. The Anunnaki are not characters within the story of the world. They are part of the structure that makes the story possible. They exist at a level where explanation gives way to assumption and narrative gives way to authority. For modern readers, this creates a persistent sense of frustration. We encounter the Anunnaki repeatedly, sense their significance, and yet find ourselves unable to grasp them in familiar terms. We search for stories that are not there, for personalities that were never intended to exist, and for explanations that were never written. This frustration is itself instructive. It reveals the limits of our interpretive framework and forces us to confront the possibility that ancient societies organized meaning differently. Not everything that mattered was meant to be narrated. Not every authority was meant to be personalized. Some structures were so foundational that they operated beyond the reach of story. The Anunnaki occupy this space. They are everywhere and nowhere, invoked and assumed, powerful and silent. Their role is not to act, but to legitimize action. Their presence is not dramatic, but structural. This realization pushes the inquiry in a new direction. If the Anunnaki were always present but never explained, and if their authority operated at a level beyond narrative, then the key to understanding them may not lie in myth alone. It may lie in how time itself was understood, measured, and recorded in the world that invoked them. Among all the silences that surround the Anunnaki, none is more disturbing than the one embedded in the way time itself is recorded. The problem does not appear as mythic exaggeration or poetic symbolism, but as something far more unsettling, a set of numbers written plainly, consistently, and without apology. These numbers appear in a document that does not read like mythology at all, but like administration. It is here that the lost epoch becomes impossible to ignore. The Sumerian king list presents itself as a straightforward historical record. It names kings, assigns reign lengths, and traces the transfer of authority from one city to another. Its structure is methodical, repetitive, and bureaucratic. There is no narrative flourish, no theological debate, no attempt to persuade. It reads like a ledger of power. And yet at the very beginning of this list, time behaves in a way that should not exist. Before a great flood, the text tells us, kingship descended from heaven. 8 rulers governed 5 cities. Their reigns are not measured in years or decades, but in spans so vast they defy modern comprehension. Tens of thousands of years. In total, more than 200,000 years of rule are recorded before the flood arrives and resets the world. The text does not signal that these numbers are symbolic. It does not warn the reader that myth has begun. It does not change tone, structure, or language. It simply records the numbers and moves on. This is where the discomfort begins. If these figures appeared in a poem or a hymn, they could be dismissed as metaphor. If they were accompanied by supernatural descriptions or moral lessons, they could be safely categorized as myth. But they are not. They are embedded in the same administrative format used to describe later kings whose reigns align with archaeological timelines. The text treats pre-flood time and post-flood time as part of a single continuum, differing only in scale. Modern scholarship often resolves this discomfort by declaring the early reigns symbolic, an expression of divine perfection or cosmic order rather than literal chronology. Yet this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why use such precise numbers if symbolism was the goal? Why maintain internal consistency across copies of the text? Why place these figures within a document whose primary function appears to be historical legitimation rather than theological speculation? The deeper issue is not whether these reigns were literal. The deeper issue is that the people who recorded them did not feel the need to clarify. They did not anticipate disbelief. They did not mark a boundary between ordinary time and extraordinary time. From the perspective of the text, these reigns belong to a category of time that did not require justification. This is where the Anunnaki re-enter the picture. The earliest kings are not portrayed as ordinary humans elevated by chance or conquest. Kingship itself is described as something that descends from heaven. Authority arrives fully formed, sanctioned at a cosmic level. The figures who ruled during this vast pre-flood span operate within a framework where divine order and temporal duration follow rules different from those of later history. The Anunnaki are not always named explicitly in this context, but their conceptual presence is unmistakable. This is the world they authorize. What we are encountering here is not merely an exaggeration of lifespan, but a different conception of time. Time in this early framework does not behave as a linear, uniform measure. It is hierarchical. Certain eras carry a density of authority and meaning that later periods do not. The duration of rule reflects not biological lifespan, but the weight of cosmic order assigned to a given phase of existence. From a modern standpoint, this is difficult to accept because our concept of time is uniform and mechanical. A year is a year, regardless of who lives within it. In ancient Mesopotamian thought, time appears to have been something that could change in quality as well as quantity. Certain periods were closer to the source of order, more saturated with divine structure, and therefore extended beyond ordinary limits. This interpretation does not require belief in impossibly long human lifespans. It requires recognition that the text is operating with a temporal framework that no longer exists. The problem is not that the numbers are wrong, but that the conceptual system that made them meaningful has vanished. This disappearance is part of the lost epoch. The pre-flood kings belong to a world governed by different assumptions about authority, memory, and duration. After the flood, reigns become shorter. Kings become more recognizably human. History begins to resemble what we are accustomed to recording. Something fundamental has shifted, not just in narrative, but in how time itself is understood. The text does not explain this shift. It does not dramatize it. It does not frame it as a loss. It simply records the change and continues. Once again, silence marks the transition. What makes this especially significant is that the Anunnaki remain largely unchanged across this divide. Whether time stretches across tens of thousands of years or collapses into human scale, their authority persists. They anchor both worlds, the one before the flood and the one after. This suggests that they operate at a level above temporal fluctuation, unaffected by the compression or expansion of history. From this perspective, the impossible time spans are not anomalies to be corrected, but signals pointing toward a lost framework of understanding. They indicate that the earliest writers were recording something they considered real, meaningful, and orderly, even if it no longer fits within our conceptual limits. The silence surrounding these numbers is telling. There is no attempt to persuade, no defensive explanation, no acknowledgement that the figures might be questioned. The text assumes acceptance. It assumes that its audience understands what kind of time is being described. We do not. And that gap in understanding is precisely the point. The lost epoch is not only a period of missing history, it is a missing way of thinking about time itself. The Anunnaki stand within this gap, unchanged and unexplained, linking a world where time behaves differently to one where it does not. Before we can move further, another question emerges. If time itself was once understood differently, how reliable is our attempt to place ancient events into a single linear chronology? And what happens when the clocks we use to measure the past are fundamentally incompatible with the time the past believed it was living in? Once the problem of impossible time enters the discussion, it becomes clear that the difficulty is not confined to a single text or an isolated tradition. It spreads outward into the entire structure of ancient chronology itself. The further scholars attempt to align Mesopotamian history with a precise timeline, the more unstable that timeline becomes. What initially appears to be a technical disagreement about dates slowly reveals itself as a deeper incompatibility between modern methods of measuring time and ancient ways of organizing it. Modern chronology depends on fixed anchors. Absolute dates, astronomical observations, synchronisms between cultures, and stratified archaeological layers are used to construct a linear sequence in which events can be placed with increasing precision. In the case of ancient Mesopotamia, these anchors exist, but they do not align cleanly. Instead, historians are forced to work with multiple competing chronologies that differ not by a few years, but by decades and sometimes centuries. High chronology, middle chronology, and low chronology all attempt to reconstruct the same sequence of rulers and events, yet they disagree on when those events occurred. These discrepancies are not the result of careless scholarship. They arise because the source material itself does not behave like a modern historical record. Kings are listed without absolute dates, reigns overlap without explanation. Dynasties rise and fall in ways that resist clean sequencing. Astronomical references appear, but they are sparse and often ambiguous. Synchronisms with neighboring regions exist, but they too rely on fragile chains of inference. The result is a historical framework that can shift by as much as 200 years, depending on which assumptions are adopted. For a modern historian, this is deeply uncomfortable. It undermines the sense of control that chronology is supposed to provide. Yet from the perspective of the ancient writers, this instability may not have been a problem at all. The Mesopotamian record was not designed to support a single universal timeline. It was designed to preserve legitimacy, continuity, and authority within specific cultural and political contexts. Kingship mattered more than dates. Succession mattered more than synchronization. What was important was that authority flowed correctly from one ruler to the next, not that the flow could be mapped precisely onto an abstract calendar centuries later. This helps explain why attempts to place the Anunnaki within a linear historical progression repeatedly fail. They do not belong to a specific point on the timeline because they are not defined by temporal sequence. Their authority does not emerge, evolve, or disappear in ways that can be dated. They are present before the flood and after it. They persist across dynastic changes. They remain conceptually stable, even as human history compresses and reorganizes itself around them. From a modern perspective, this feels like evasion. We want to know when belief in the Anunnaki began, how it developed, and when it declined. The sources do not cooperate because they were not tracking belief as an evolving phenomenon. They were invoking a framework of order that was assumed to exist beyond historical change. The broken nature of ancient chronology is therefore not simply a technical inconvenience. It is a signal that time itself functioned differently within the conceptual world of early Mesopotamia. Events were not organized primarily by when they occurred, but by how they related to authority, legitimacy, and cosmic structure. A king ruled because kingship had descended, not because he occupied a specific year in a calendar. This difference becomes especially important when modern scholars attempt to harmonize Mesopotamian history with that of surrounding civilizations. Egyptian timelines, Levantine chronologies, and later Greek records all operate with their own assumptions and reference points. Aligning them requires compromises that flatten cultural differences in how time was understood. In the process, the distinct logic of Mesopotamian chronology is often lost. What remains is a hybrid system that satisfies modern expectations of order while obscuring the original structure of meaning. Dates become more precise, but understanding becomes thinner. The Anunnaki, once again, fall into the gap created by this process. They cannot be pinned down because the framework we are using was never meant to contain them. This raises an important methodological question. If ancient chronology is broken by modern standards, should it be repaired or should it be studied as broken? The instinct to fix it is strong. Precision feels like progress. Yet in this case, repairing the clock may erase the very features that make the past intelligible on its own terms. The lost epoch is visible here not as a missing stretch of time, but as a missing alignment between systems of understanding. We are attempting to read a record produced by one conception of time using tools designed for another. The resulting distortions are inevitable. The Anunnaki exist within this distortion. They appear timeless, not because they transcend time in a mystical sense, but because they belong to a framework in which time was not the primary organizing principle. Their persistence across incompatible chronologies is not evidence of mythic exaggeration, but of conceptual mismatch. Recognizing this does not solve the problem of dating ancient events. It reframes it. It suggests that the instability of chronology is not merely a failure of evidence, but a reminder that the past did not experience itself as we experience it now. Time was not a neutral container. It was a quality shaped by authority, memory, and cosmic order. If this is true, then the question of what archaeology can and cannot recover becomes even more important, because when time itself resists reconstruction, material evidence becomes the next line of inquiry. And there, too, silence awaits. When written records fall silent or resist interpretation, archaeology is often expected to provide clarity. Material evidence feels more reliable, more objective, less dependent on cultural assumptions. Stones, foundations, tools, and ruins seem to promise direct access to the past, untouched by ideology or narrative bias. Yet in the case of the Anunnaki, archaeology does not resolve the silence, it deepens it. Mesopotamia is one of the most archaeologically rich regions on Earth, but it is also one of the least fully explored. Vast areas remain unexcavated, buried beneath modern cities, agricultural land, or layers of sediment deposited by millennia of flooding. Of the sites that have been excavated, only a fraction has been studied in detail, and an even smaller fraction has been preserved intact. War, looting, environmental damage, and the reuse of ancient materials have all taken their toll. What survives is uneven, fragmentary, and often disconnected from its original context. Despite this, certain patterns are clear. Temples dedicated to specific gods are abundant. Their layouts, inscriptions, and offerings reveal a great deal about how individual deities were worshipped, how rituals were performed, and how divine favor was sought. Administrative buildings, palaces, and city walls speak to systems of power and control. Graves and household artifacts provide glimpses into daily life. What is striking is what does not appear. There is no archaeological evidence for a centralized cult of the Anunnaki as a collective. No grand temples bearing their name. No standardized iconography that represents them as a unified group. No ritual complexes clearly dedicated to their veneration. Where individual gods leave distinct material footprints, the Anunnaki do not. This absence is not easily dismissed as coincidence. If the Anunnaki were merely another group of gods comparable to others in the pantheon, we would expect to find material traces of their worship. The fact that we do not suggests that their role was fundamentally different. They were not approached through offerings or prayer in the same way. They were not localized to specific cities or shrines. Their authority did not require physical representation. Archaeology thus reinforces what the texts imply. The Anunnaki were not objects of popular devotion. They did not operate at the level of everyday religious practice. Their influence was structural rather than transactional. They did not need temples because they were not negotiated with. They did not need images because they were not imagined in human terms. Their power was not something that could be attracted or appeased. It simply existed. This kind of authority leaves few material traces. It is embedded in systems rather than monuments. It shapes outcomes without announcing itself. In modern terms, it resembles legal frameworks or economic systems more than personal figures of power. We do not build temples to constitutions. We do not sculpt statues of gravity. Yet both profoundly shape how societies function. The absence of material evidence also highlights the limits of archaeology itself. Archaeology can recover what was built, used, and discarded. It cannot easily recover assumptions, abstractions, or conceptual frameworks. It reveals how people acted, but not always why those actions made sense to them. When a concept operates at the level of shared understanding rather than ritual practice, it may leave little or no physical trace. This does not mean that the Anunnaki were unreal or insignificant. It means that their significance did not depend on material expression. They belonged to a layer of belief that structured reality rather than decorating it. That layer is precisely the one most vulnerable to loss. There is another dimension to this silence. The physical landscape of Mesopotamia has changed dramatically over time. Rivers have shifted course. Cities have been abandoned and rebuilt. Entire regions have been submerged or eroded. What the earth did not keep is not only artifacts, but context. Even when objects survive, the networks of meaning that connected them often do not. Libraries burned. Archives collapsed. Temples were dismantled and their bricks reused. Each act of destruction or reuse stripped away another layer of association. Over centuries, the cumulative effect was not just loss, but simplification. Complex systems of meaning were reduced to isolated remnants. Names survived where explanations did not. The Anunnaki may be among the casualties of this process, not because their traces were erased deliberately, but because the forms their authority took were never designed to survive physical disruption. They lived in institutional continuity, ritual repetition, and shared understanding. Once those collapsed, little remained for archaeology to recover. This realization forces a re-evaluation of what counts as evidence. The absence of temples and artifacts does not disprove the importance of the Anunnaki. It suggests that their role was never meant to be materially visible in the first place. Their silence in the ground mirrors their silence in the texts. Both point toward a concept that operated beyond the reach of stone and clay. What archaeology gives us, then, is not confirmation or denial, but boundary. It shows us where material inquiry ends and where another kind of understanding must begin. It reminds us that some of the most influential structures in human history are the ones least likely to survive as objects. If the Anunnaki cannot be fully recovered through texts or through material remains, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where then did their meaning reside? And what kind of knowledge could exist so centrally, yet leave behind so little that we can grasp today? By the time the limits of text and archaeology become clear, the inquiry is forced into a more uncomfortable territory. If the Anunnaki cannot be fully understood through surviving writings, and if material evidence offers no direct confirmation of their role, then their meaning must have existed in a form that did not depend on either. This is where the modern instinct to equate knowledge with documentation begins to fail. In ancient Mesopotamia, writing was not the primary vessel of understanding. It was one tool among many, and not necessarily the most trusted one. Literacy was restricted. Scribal training was long and specialized. Texts were produced within institutions and for institutional purposes. They were not designed to transmit complete worldviews, but to support systems that already existed. Much of what people knew was never written down because it did not need to be. Knowledge in this world was layered. Some information was public and practical. Some was technical and restricted. Some was symbolic, embodied in ritual, architecture, and repetition rather than language. The most foundational assumptions often existed at the deepest level, transmitted through participation rather than instruction. To belong to the system was to absorb its logic without ever seeing it spelled out. This distinction is crucial for understanding the silence around the Anunnaki. Their role may have belonged to a category of knowledge that was never meant to be fixed in writing. It may have been communicated through initiation, through oral tradition, or through the performance of ritual that encoded meaning without articulating it explicitly. Such knowledge survives only as long as the social structures that carry it remain intact. Once those structures collapse, the knowledge vanishes with them. The written record gives us the surface language of belief, but not its operating system. We see references to authority, fate, and order, but not the internal logic that made those references coherent. The Anunnaki appear as markers within this system, pointing to something that once anchored meaning but no longer does. Modern readers often assume that what is written is what mattered most. In many ancient societies, the opposite was true. Writing was used for what needed to be remembered precisely, not for what needed to be understood deeply. Deep understanding was cultivated through practice, repetition, and lived experience. It was embedded in roles rather than texts. This helps explain why later scribes could copy references to the Anunnaki accurately without necessarily understanding them in the same way their predecessors had. The words survived, but the framework that gave them significance eroded. Over time, what had once been a living concept hardened into a term whose meaning was increasingly abstract and remote. The Anunnaki may therefore represent a form of knowledge that was never fully textualized. Their silence is not the result of loss alone, but of design. They belong to a realm of understanding that writing could reference but not contain. When that realm disappeared, writing was left pointing towards something it could no longer explain. This realization reframes the lost epoch yet again. It is not simply a period of missing records or destroyed archives. It is the loss of an entire mode of transmission, a way of knowing that relied on continuity, presence, and shared participation rather than preservation. Once broken, it cannot be reconstructed from fragments. This also clarifies why attempts to recover the Anunnaki through translation alone are inevitably unsatisfying. Language can carry meaning only within the context that gives it structure. When that context is gone, translation becomes an act of approximation rather than recovery. We can map words to words, but not systems to systems. The temptation in such situations is to replace what is missing with speculation. Faced with silence, we invent explanations that feel complete. We supply origins, motivations, and narratives that the sources themselves never provide. In doing so, we may gain coherence, but we lose fidelity to the past. The Anunnaki challenge this impulse. They resist being turned into a story because they were not a story to begin with. They were part of a framework that organized reality without narrating itself. To understand them requires accepting that some knowledge does not survive transition and that absence is not always accidental. This acceptance is difficult because it confronts a deeper anxiety. If so much of ancient understanding could vanish so completely, what does that say about the durability of our own systems of knowledge? What assumptions do we live by that future generations will inherit only as unexplained references, stripped of the logic that once made them meaningful? The silence of the Anunnaki is not only about the past, it is a mirror held up to the present. It reveals how much of what we take for granted depends on continuity, and how fragile that continuity truly is. Before drawing conclusions, one final challenge remains. If silence invites distortion, what happens when modern interpretations rush in to fill the gap? And how easily does explanation turn into invention? When silence persists long enough, it begins to provoke discomfort. Human understanding seeks closure, coherence, and narrative resolution, And when the historical record refuses to provide these, something else moves in to take their place. In the case of the Anunnaki, this process has been especially visible. Where ancient texts fall silent, modern interpretations grow louder, and the absence of explanation becomes an invitation not for patience, but for invention. In recent decades, the Anunnaki have been absorbed into a range of speculative frameworks that promise clarity where scholarship offers uncertainty. They are recast as extraterrestrial visitors, advanced engineers, or forgotten rulers of a lost technological age. These interpretations often present themselves as bold alternatives to academic caution, claiming to restore what history has supposedly suppressed or ignored. Yet their appeal lies less in evidence than in psychology. They satisfy a desire for answers in a space where the past offers none. What makes these modern narratives compelling is not their accuracy, but their decisiveness. They replace ambiguity with certainty and silence with spectacle. Complex problems are reduced to simple explanations. Long spans of uncertainty collapse into a single dramatic revelation. The Anunnaki become characters again, complete with motives, origins, and intentions that feel familiar to a modern audience. This transformation comes at a cost. In filling the silence, these narratives overwrite it. They treat the absence of explanation as a failure to be corrected rather than a feature to be understood. The result is not a deeper engagement with the ancient material, but a displacement of it. The Anunnaki are no longer studied as a concept rooted in Mesopotamian thought, but repurposed to serve contemporary anxieties and fascinations. From a scholarly perspective, this is deeply problematic. The ancient sources do not support such reconstructions. Linguistic analysis, comparative mythology, and archaeological context all point away from literalist interpretations that impose modern categories onto ancient concepts. The Anunnaki were not described as visitors from elsewhere, nor as biological beings operating within a technological framework recognizable to us. These ideas arise not from the texts, but from the modern need to resolve uncertainty. Yet simply dismissing these interpretations as fringe misses an important point. They reveal how difficult it is for modern culture to tolerate silence. We are accustomed to explanations that close questions rather than open them. When faced with gaps, we instinctively fill them, even if what we fill them with reflects our own assumptions more than the past itself. The danger here is not curiosity, but projection. When modern narratives impose contemporary ideas onto ancient frameworks, they erase the very difference that makes the past worth studying. The Anunnaki become mirrors of modern concerns rather than windows into ancient thought. What is lost is not only accuracy but humility. There is also an ethical dimension to this process. By transforming the Anunnaki into figures that fit modern expectations, we risk dismissing the intellectual sophistication of the cultures that first invoked them. Ancient Mesopotamian societies developed complex systems of law, astronomy, administration, and ritual. To suggest that their cosmology must be explained through modern speculative frameworks is to underestimate their capacity for abstract thought on their own terms. Noise replaces silence, but understanding does not necessarily follow. The Anunnaki do not need to be turned into something else in order to matter. Their significance lies precisely in the way they resist assimilation into familiar narratives. They force us to confront the limits of interpretation and the temptation to mistake explanation for insight. This tension between silence and noise reveals something fundamental about historical inquiry. Not every gap is meant to be filled. Some gaps mark the edges of what can be known. When we rush to cross those edges, we risk losing contact with the past rather than gaining it. Recognizing this does not mean abandoning inquiry. It means changing its direction. Instead of asking what the Anunnaki were in terms we already understand, we must ask what their silence tells us about the structure of ancient knowledge and the conditions under which meaning was preserved or allowed to disappear. In doing so, the Anunnaki become less a mystery to be solved and more a case study in historical restraint. They remind us that the past does not owe us clarity, and that the desire for explanation can itself become an obstacle to understanding. As the noise recedes, one final perspective begins to emerge. The silence surrounding the Anunnaki may not only illuminate ancient civilizations, it may also reflect something about us, about how our own systems of meaning will one day be interpreted, misinterpreted, or replaced by narratives we never intended. As the silence surrounding the Anunnaki is traced through texts, archaeology, and modern interpretation, a final shift in perspective becomes unavoidable. The question slowly turns inward. What if the difficulty in understanding the Anunnaki does not arise solely from the past, but from the present? What if the silence we encounter is not only a feature of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge, but a reflection of how all complex systems appear once the context that sustained them is gone? To explore this possibility, it is useful to reverse the direction of inquiry. Instead of asking how ancient people understood the Anunnaki, we can ask how future societies might one day understand us. Imagine a distant civilization attempting to reconstruct the modern world from fragments of infrastructure, partial records, and scattered terminology. They might encounter references to concepts like markets, algorithms, networks, or governance systems that once shaped human behavior at every level. These forces would appear everywhere in the record and yet nowhere clearly defined. They would be invoked as causes, authorities, and explanations without ever being personified or narrated. Future interpreters might assume that these forces were deities or external intelligences or hidden rulers. They might search for temples to capitalism or monuments to data. They might invent elaborate stories to explain what no longer has an obvious physical form. In doing so, they would not be foolish. They would be doing exactly what humans have always done when confronted with incomplete understanding. This thought experiment reveals the Anunnaki in a new light. They may represent not an anomaly in ancient history, but a familiar pattern in how power and structure are remembered once their operational context disappears. Systems that once functioned as abstract frameworks are later reinterpreted as beings. Processes become personalities. Authority becomes myth. The Anunnaki may have been the conceptual shorthand for a system of order so deeply integrated into Mesopotamian life that it did not require constant articulation. When that system collapsed or transformed, its traces remained only as names and references, stripped of the mechanisms that once made them intelligible. What survives looks like mystery, but what was lived may have felt entirely ordinary. Seen this way, the silence is not empty. It is full of what once made sense without being spoken. This perspective also explains why the Anunnaki appear stable across enormous spans of time, while human institutions change rapidly. They are not tied to individual rulers or specific cities. They represent continuity at a level above political fluctuation. Their apparent timelessness is not supernatural, but structural. They endure in the record because they stood for the conditions under which authority itself was possible. When those conditions disappeared, what remained was a name without its function. Later generations inherited the term, but not the system it referred to. Over time, the gap widened, meaning drained away. Silence took its place. This process is not unique to Mesopotamia. It occurs whenever complex systems outlast the societies that created them. Legal traditions become ritual. Technologies become legend. Administrative frameworks become mythology. The Anunnaki may simply be one of the earliest and most visible examples of this transformation. Recognizing this does not diminish their significance. It deepens it. It shifts the focus from trying to identify what the Anunnaki were to understanding what kind of role they played in organizing reality. They become evidence of how civilizations encode authority, how they preserve it, and how it eventually becomes unreadable. This realization carries an unsettling implication. Much of what we consider foundational today may one day survive only as fragments, references, and misunderstood terms. Our own silences are already forming. The assumptions that feel self-evident now may one day be the most opaque. The Anunnaki remind us that history does not preserve intention. It preserves residue. It captures what was said, built, and recorded, but not the mental frameworks that made those things coherent. When those frameworks vanish, what remains can be mistaken for something entirely different. In this sense, the Anunnaki are not an isolated mystery. They are a warning. They show us how easily meaning dissolves when continuity breaks, and how quickly structure turns into myth once its function is forgotten. As the inquiry reaches this point, the original question begins to dissolve. The silence at the heart of Anunnaki history may not be something to overcome. It may be something to recognize as inevitable. A reminder that every civilization leaves behind not a complete account of itself, but a distorted echo shaped by what survives and what does not. One final step remains. If silence is inevitable, and if meaning cannot always be recovered, then what responsibility does that place on us as interpreters of the past? And what does it mean to accept uncertainty not as a failure of knowledge, but as its boundary? At the end of this inquiry, the silence remains. It has not been resolved, decoded, or transformed into a final explanation, and that outcome is not a failure. It is the point. The Anunnaki do not emerge as a hidden species, a forgotten dynasty, or a lost chapter waiting to be restored. They remain what the record has always presented them as, a presence without exposition, an authority without narrative, a name that points beyond what writing was ever meant to preserve. What we encounter here is not an unsolved puzzle, but a boundary, a place where historical recovery gives way to historical humility. The lost epoch is not a missing era in the sense of a chronological gap that can be filled with new discoveries. It is a conceptual gap, a space where the assumptions that once made the world intelligible no longer survive. It exists between what was lived and what was written, between what was understood and what was recorded, between systems that function seamlessly and the fragments that remain once those systems collapsed. This gap cannot be bridged by excavation alone because it is not made of stone or clay. It is made of context, continuity, and shared understanding. Throughout the earliest Mesopotamian record, the Anunnaki occupy this space. They are not introduced because they did not need to be. They are not explained because explanation was unnecessary. Their authority is invoked rather than justified, assumed rather than defended. The texts speak as if the framework they represent will always be present, as if the conditions that give meaning to their name will never disappear. In doing so, they reveal a confidence that history later proved to be fragile. When continuity broke, when institutions changed, when ritual practice eroded, and when the social structures that carried knowledge dissolved, the Anunnaki were left behind as a residue. Their name survived, but the logic that sustained it did not. What had once been background became foreground. What had once been assumed became mysterious. Silence replaced familiarity. This was not an intentional erasure, but an unintended consequence of cultural transformation. This transformation reveals something fundamental about how history works. The past does not vanish evenly. It sheds layers. It preserves what was written and discards what was lived. It keeps records but loses context. Over time, the most important elements of a civilization are often the least likely to survive in intelligible form. What remains is not a complete memory, but a selective trace shaped by durability rather than significance. The Anunnaki illustrate this process with unusual clarity. They were not lost because they were insignificant. They were lost because they were foundational. Their role was so deeply embedded in the structure of Mesopotamian thought that it did not need to be articulated. When that structure disappeared, there was nothing left to explain. The silence we encounter is therefore not the silence of absence, but the silence left behind when a framework collapses and only its references endure. If this exploration has resonated with you, you are welcome to support the channel in simple ways by liking the video, sharing it with someone who might find these questions meaningful, or subscribing if you would like to continue exploring subjects like this together. Your support helps make it possible to keep examining these long, quiet questions without rushing them. This recognition carries an important lesson for how we understand historical knowledge. The goal of studying the past is not always to reconstruct what was in full detail, but to recognize the limits of reconstruction itself. Some questions cannot be answered not because evidence is missing, but because the kind of evidence we would need was never meant to exist independently of lived experience. Writing was never designed to preserve everything, and history is not obligated to satisfy modern expectations of completeness. Accepting this is difficult. It runs against the modern belief that more data will always produce more clarity, that accumulation inevitably leads to understanding. The Anunnaki challenge that belief. They show that information without context can deepen confusion rather than resolve it, and that silence can sometimes carry more meaning than explanation. They remind us that knowing where understanding ends is itself a form of knowledge. The lost epoch, then, is not confined to ancient Mesopotamia. It is a recurring feature of human history. Every civilization leaves behind unexplained references, assumptions without documentation, and structures whose original rationale no longer survives. Over time, these fragments invite speculation, distortion, and reinvention. They become myths not because they were mythical to begin with, but because their original function has been forgotten. In this sense, the Anunnaki are not an exception. They are an early example of a universal pattern. They remind us that history is not a complete record of the past, but a selective memory shaped by what endures and what does not. Meaning is fragile. Context is perishable. Silence accumulates. And in that accumulation, certainty gives way to interpretation. For us, the lesson is not to abandon inquiry, but to practice restraint. We can rush to fill silence with certainty, imposing narratives that reflect our own assumptions rather than ancient realities. Or we can approach the past with patience, accepting that not all absence is an error and not all mystery is meant to be solved. The first path offers comfort. The second offers understanding. The Anunnaki ask us to choose the second path. They ask us to listen to what history does not say, and to recognize that some of the most important chapters of human experience may not be missing at all. They may have never been written, never meant to survive, and never intended for us to recover in full. The lost epoch is not a hidden truth waiting to be revealed. It is the space where certainty ends and responsibility begins. It reminds us that history does not belong to us, and that understanding the past is not about possession or mastery, but about learning to live with silence and to reflect on what that silence teaches us about ourselves.